Hello folks, and in this video we are going to be talking about GoRouter. GoRouter is a Flutter package that helps you to do navigations in your Flutter apps. And today we are going to see how you can use GoRouter and combine that with Riverpod and do your authentication in your Flutter apps. And without further ado, let's get started. We have a project here that I've called Auth Riverpod GoRouter, and I have built out a simple login screen that takes in the email address and then password. And we are going to mock some sort of a backend to return a result for us when we pass this to the service. And then here is the folder structure that we are going to be using. I have a folder called UI that houses our home screen and our login screen. This login screen is what you're looking at the screen right now. And then we have a home screen that is pretty empty. We are going to get back to that later. But in the library, let's create a new folder, and we're going to call the folder repository. This folder is going to house our auth repository that we are going to use to do the authentication. The next folder you're going to create is your service. This service folder is going to house the auth service that is going to return a result for us when we pass in the email address and the password to it. The next thing to do is to install some of the packages that we are going to use. And if you go back to your prospect.yaml file, we have empty dependencies right now. So if you go to your terminal or your view, go to command palette, and then go to prospect assist, we are needing GoRouter. So I'm going to type in GoRouter here, and it's going to add that in our dependencies. The next thing we need is a package called Hooks Riverpod. I like Hooks Riverpod because it comes with Flutter hooks. Although we don't need that in this tutorial, so we are going to install Riverpod instead. So let's go ahead and use prospect assist again, and then type in Flutter Riverpod. So it's going to install Flutter Riverpod for us, and then GoRouter. And that is what we need for this project to do authentication. Next, we are going to create a file called authservice.dart in our service file. And this will be a class of authservice. And we are going to create a method called login that will return a token for us after some time. So we have login is going to take a string of email, string of password, and after some milliseconds, let's increase this to 5,000, it's going to return an auth token for us. One more thing to do here is to declare a global provider that is going to that we are going to call auth service provider, and it's going to return a provider that is of type auth service, like this. So for here, it's going to return Flutter Riverpod, but here it's going to take an argument of rev, which is going to return an auth service. So we are creating this here because we will need to access this provider in our repository when we want to read this provider. Next is to create an auth repository. So go to your repository folder, and we are creating auth repository.dart. And in the file, you're going to create a class called auth repository. And it's going to take a constructor of your auth service like this. So we import a service here, and in the constructor, it's going to take an auth service like this. so that when you do a feature of string and you do login, which would take a string of email, a string of password, and you make it a sync, you can easily return auth service.login like this. But there's a problem. How do your auth repository know about auth service? We can easily do that by creating a global provider, and we call it auth repository provider, which is going to be equal to a provider that has the type auth repository. And then inside here, when you're returning the auth repository, you can read the auth service provider here. That makes it easily testable because you have just injected this auth service provider in your auth repository, and you can easily test this. So now we are done with our auth repository. Next, let's configure GoRouter and Riverpod. Okay, the first thing is, instead of returning my app here, we are going to wrap it with provider scope, because this provider scope makes our global provider accessible throughout the app. Also, the next thing is to make sure that this is returning material app.router. This .router is from, you guessed it, GoRouter. And then we are going to get rid of this home. Also, instead of extending stateless widgets here, we are going to extend consumer widget. Instead, consumer widget is from Flutter Riverpod. And in the build method here, we are going to add another argument, which is widget ref and ref. But there is something this needs again. If we check here, it needs an argument of route information parser and router delegate. But we are going to create a provider called the route provider, which is going to help with our routing. So before that, let's prepare that, and we are going to create a final router ref.watch, and it's going to watch a router provider. We're going to create the router provider in a bit. And it still needs us to pass in the route information parser and the router delegate. And to do that, we are going to just do it like this. Next, let's create a folder in our library called providers. And in here, we are going to create a new file called router provider.dart. So we are going to create a global variable called router provider, which is going to be equals to provider, but this time it will be of type GoRouter. So here is going to take in a widget ref. And then it's going to return GoRouter. So we are going to return GoRouter here, the GoRouter itself. Okay, so let's import our Riverpod here. And then if you look at GoRouter, GoRouter needs, if you over that, there are lots of options here. There's initial location, there's a URL path strategy, and then there's a debug log here. So let's do some configurations. And first, let's set the debug log to be true so that we can see our navigation routes on the terminal. Part of what we need for GoRouter is also refresh listenable. This refresh listenable is listening for GoRouter refreshes. So when that listenable occurs, GoRouter refreshes and listens for more events. Okay, so we are going to create a provider that handles those events for us. And I'm going to call it a router notifier. And it's going to extend a change notifier. And here we are going to declare ref, which we will pass into the constructor, because we will need this ref at a later time. And also, I'll open the brackets here because I need to listen to events here when the router is initialized. Also, I need to get a list of routes, and it's going to be a list of go routes which returns. So in this list, we are going to declare all our routes. For example, this is what we need. We need a go route, which is of login, and then we need a go route of home. Now that we have declared our routes, we can import each of the screens here. For example, we are importing home and login screen. We can't import home because we don't have a home screen. So let's create a stateless widget here and call it home screen. And it's going to import material. So we are done with the home screen. So let's go back and try to import it here, which we have done. Okay, and there is also something that we need in GoRoute. You have to set the path of each of the screens that you are going to. So here, I'm going to give it login. And here, for the path, I'm going to give it the default path. And when you want to do the default path, you just put a /. We are just going to pass in state here and also pass in state here. Next, you come up here and declare a variable called router, which is going to be our router notifier here. And router notifier is going to take in a ref from provider. Now you can then say your refresh listenable is a router, because router is a change notifier. So this is looking for a change notifier, which is a listenable. And then you can say your router dot routes here, which is going to give you the routes that we have declared down here. Okay, so we are not done yet. What we need to do is to create a method that will contain our navigation logic that will tell when GoRouter should navigate to the home or to the login screen. We're going to declare a method here called redirect logic. This is going to take in argument of GoRouter state. But before we implement this, we need to create a login controller that will handle the state of the user. So let's go ahead and go to your provider and create a new provider. And we're going to call it Logincontroller provider dot. And inside your provider folder, let's create a new folder called states. And in here, we are going to create something called login states that we will declare our states of the user. Before we go ahead here, we need one more package to compare state objects. And that package is called equatable. So I'm going to type it here, equatable, and it's going to install that for us. Go to postspec, we have equatable here. And then we go back to our login states. And these are the states that we need. You can see that I created a class called login state, which extends equatable. Now, with this equatable, we can compare the states. Now, I've declared 4 more states, which is login state initial, which is extending our login state, login state loading, login state success, login state errors. And they are very self-descriptive because you can tell that when there's a login error, we are going to throw this. When there's a success, when there's a loading, and then when there's an initial state. And with this login state, we'll be able to go back to our login controller and create a login controller. So with that, I can create a class called login controller, and which is going to extend a state notifier. So we are using state notifier because we need to be able to handle some sort of states. So state notifier is going to take in an argument of login state like this. So we need to import state notifier from Riverpod. And in the super constructor, we can make sure that an initial state is login state initial. Next, we will declare a variable called ref. And as you know how we do it, we will pass in this ref in a constructor. Next, we create a method called login. And here is where we will admit those states. So immediately someone clicks on login and we hit this method, we are going to first set the state to be equals to login state loading, so that we will tell the user that this something is loading. And then we await ref dot read auth controller auth repository provider here, and we can do login and pass in the email and password to login from the auth repository provider. And then we will return a state of success. Now we can improve this code a bit because there's no how you can tell if there's an error. You can do that by having a try catch in your method here. So you can do try and catch here, which is going to catch the exception, and you're going to set the state to login error. But login error needs an argument which is going to be error. So you can do error to string here. And then we are going to move this right inside here, as you can see. And the login state, we're going to do it inside here, after here. So we are good to go for our login state. Lastly, here we create a global controller provider called login controller provider, which we are going to be using. We are almost there, but we need to go back to our provider, which is our router provider, and complete the logic here. Now, the first thing we want to do here is to create a variable which we are going to call login state. And it's going to read, which is ref.read, our login controller provider. There is a reason why we didn't use watch here. GoRouter already has a listenable which is listening for this router notifier. So there's no need to use a watch, which is going to trigger the rebuild of the environment. Next, we will use the state of the GoRouter, which is the GoRouter state, to know if the user is logged in or not. So we use the state to know where the user is at that particular moment. So we declare another variable, are we logging in? equals to state.location. If the user is as login, then we use it to decide if we want to log in or not. Next, we want to know, based on the state of our login controller. So we can say, if login state is login state.sex, and we are going to return, are we logging in? If we are logging in, return null, else return login. So that means that if you are logging in, just return null. If not, redirect to the login. Next, we'll declare that if are we logging in, then return home. That means that this has taken care of our login, and this will take care of our home. Lastly, we'll return null if none of these conditions are met. Next, in the router notifier, we can do this and do a ref.listen. Ref.listen, we take in login state, and we take in login provider. And if the state changes, just notify listeners. That's it. And lastly, we will go back to GoRouter and tell GoRouter to use our redirect logic. We just do this. Redirect router.redirect logic. Now that we are done with our router provider, we go back to the main.dart and import it here. And after we have imported that, then we can go over to our login screen and then make sure that we pass the data from the UI to the service. So we do that by going to our on-press screen in our login and do ref.read. But we don't have access to ref, which means that we need to convert this stateful widget to the one that provider has and Riverpod has. So we will do stateful consumer stateful widget here, like this, which we take in consumer states, and here consumer states. And then we will have access to ref.read. And then we can pass in an auth controller, auth repository provider, and then we can do login and password. So then let's restart our project and see what happens. Okay. Level path must start with /. So let's see how we are going to solve that. To solve that, we need to go back to our routes, and it says that level path must start with /. So let's give it a /login. And then we restart. Restarting gives us a blank screen, which means that we are in the home screen, which is just an empty scaffold. To confirm that, we're just going to give it a body and give it a text that says, we are at home. So let's give it a center. And yeah, this shows that we are at home. But this is not what we want. We want that when we first launch the app, it should go to the login screen. So there's a few fixes we need to do. The first one is we need to say login state initial and not login state success. So when we do that and then we refresh, it's going to go to the login screen, which is good. Now, let's say you enter some email address and then some password. It should log us into the homepage. And when you click on login, nothing happens. Okay, so it's easily fixed because we made a mistake the other time by going to our login screen. We are calling the auth repository provider here, which is not what we should do. That is the reason why we wrote a login controller provider that will tell our GoRouter that the state has changed. So let's go back to the login screen and just do Logincontroller provider. But this time, the controller provider is a state notifier. So you need to do .notifier to be able to access the login. And when we save that, click on login, we are at home. It logs us in to the home page. So this is how you do authentication with Riverpod and GoRouter. So I hope you have been able to learn one or two things from this tutorial. And if you like this tutorial, please make sure to like, subscribe to this channel. See you next week.